If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So wrote George Orwell in his dark, dystopian vision, 1984, which saw a world governed by brutal totalitarianism. In his bleak dictatorship, citizens are under 24/7 surveillance, with the eyes of Big Brother and the one-party state watching and controlling everything the proletariat say and do. This is a world of oppressive censorship, where the government controls not only your tongue, but ultimately your thoughts too. And the term Orwellian has entered common parlance to describe the workings of authoritarian regimes and brutal draconian control via propaganda, disinformation, and the rewriting of history. And we frequently hear the anxiety expressed that we are either headed towards Orwell's 1984 or we are already in it. But 2 decades prior to the publication of this prophetic novel, we were offered quite a different dystopian vision of the future in the novel Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Huxley's dystopia is a tyranny of pleasure, self-gratification and hedonism, where the people are not coerced into compliance by the threat of violence, but are instead sedated, placated, and conditioned into obedience, and they offer no resistance to the erasure of their individuality, and they instead accept their serfdom because they are essentially given a world without difficulty, without challenge, without pain or obstacles to overcome, a world in which the gratification of pleasure is supreme, and in which your desires for pleasant sensations are always met. Both writers were not just offering a dark vision of the future, but they were also making powerful satirical comment on their present day. Huxley, writing in the wake of the First World War, was critiquing the rise of a mass production society that saw its citizens as good only for endless consumption. Orwell, writing in the wake of the Second World War and having witnessed the rise of Stalin's Soviet Union and having felt the Cold War anxiety of nascent and mutually assured destruction, was writing a political satire and a cautionary tale on the dangers of unchecked governmental power and the inhumanity of totalitarian regimes. Now, almost a century on from these works, the question often asked is this: whose dystopia are we living in? Are we closer to the Huxleyan vision or the Orwellian one? Are we governed primarily by pleasure or by pain? Here's what prophetic social commentator Neil Postman observed in Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was published in 1985, just 1 year after Orwell's projected Dystopia. Postman writes, "We were keeping our eye on 1984, but when the year came and the prophecy didn't, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we, at least, had not been visited by Orwellian nightmares. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision there was another, slightly older, slightly less well known, equally chilling. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression, but in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression and to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Let's think about that today. We're going to conduct an analysis of these two most influential and iconic works of dystopian literature, and we will see how learning to read them will teach you how to read any work of visionary literature. We're going to investigate how the dystopian genre developed, how it developed out of utopian literature. We're going to discuss the genre's philosophy and the value of it, and we're going to think about markers of totalitarianism in the modern world. And we're doing this because, at time of recording, we are now kicking off a special reading and lecture series for Brave New World, followed by 1984 at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We're having a dystopian double bill, just like in the good old days of cinema, where you'd have an A movie and a B movie and you would watch them back to back, except these are both A movies. We are going to treat these works as inversions of one another, and we're going to treat them as a whole, and we're going to compare and contrast them, and ultimately learn to heed the warnings that Orwell and Huxley gave us. So let's find out what it means to be living in either a Huxleyan or an Orwellian dystopia. But to do that, we first need to clarify our terms. What exactly do we mean by dystopia? Let's dive in and treat this discussion as an introduction and contextual primer for a reading not only of these two works, but indeed of any work of dystopian literature you want to dig into. The first thing to understand in your reading of dystopian literature is that dystopian literature is a subset of utopian literature. And what is a utopia? A utopia is a paradisical locale that by definition cannot exist. A utopia is a highly idealized society, a vision of a perfect society. What is the best way to govern society? What is the best political system that would ultimately be in the interest of everybody, or in the interest of most people? Those are the questions that utopian visions try to answer. Utopia is always out ahead of us. It is an aim or a collection of aims. It's something to reach after. As Robert Browning would say, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? And Oscar Wilde would say that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, because progress is the realization of utopias. The word utopia was coined by Sir Thomas More, a man who defiantly told King Henry VIII that he was God's servant first, God's servant before the king's, and was beheaded. Before that, in 1516, he wrote a book called Utopia, in which he explored the best way to govern society. But the concept of utopianism has been around for a very long time. It's been around even before we had words to describe it. The idea of imagined perfect lands has been around for practically as long as we have. In ancient times, you've got the myth of the Golden Age, which we spoke about earlier this year at the Hardcore Literature Book Club when we read Ovid's Metamorphoses together, and lectures are still available. Indeed, you might think of Arcadia in classical literature, or you might think of the Garden of Eden, paradise in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Thomas More was writing in the Renaissance era, which elevated both the world of classical antiquity and also simultaneously utilised reason and humanist logic to advance a vision of the future. The people of the medieval era had more or less accepted that their position in the world was due to fate. Their life circumstances came about thanks to the turning of fortune's wheel, something we discussed recently when we read Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales at the book club. But then we see, in the era of Shakespeare and Da Vinci, that there was this increasingly attractive idea that man can ordain his own limits. Man can set his own destiny. And so people began to ask, What would the perfect world look like? Because it almost certainly wasn't the one they were actually living in. More presented his book Utopia as a piece of fictional travel literature, and in it we get a dialogue with an imaginary traveller who tells us about an island that has the perfect political, social and economic systems. The island's name literally means no place. That's what Utopia means. It was a neologism composed of two Greek words. The Greek word for no or not, and the Greek word for place, topos, utopia, no place. Before coining this word, Thomas More used the Latin word for nowhere, nusquama for his locale. But interestingly, the word utopia also contains a double meaning in how it sounds, because you've got the idea of utopia as in good place. So a utopia is a good place that's also no place. More's Utopia is a republic governed by elected officials on national and local levels, and it is something of a meritocracy where people are elected based on their competence and their moral integrity. There is no private property in More's Utopia. Everything is common property, and the people share resources, and they also change houses each year to counter greed and covetousness. Not only that, but everyone wears the same clothing in order to avoid clashes of status. And further to this, everyone works the same amount of hours, everybody needs to learn a useful trade, and everybody has the same portion of leisure time to enjoy. In More's Utopia, there is religious tolerance, but atheism is regarded as something of a threat to the moral order, and the justice system of this perfect land is based on rehabilitation rather than punishment, where prisoners are put to good societal use. So, this all sounds rather socialist and communist, doesn't it? Well, More's Utopia predates these formal concepts, but we can clearly see that his vision of a perfect society is heavily collectivist rather than individualist. In many Western countries, not all, but certainly in America and to a large degree in the UK, the culture is individualist. Time and again we see this in utopian visions. We see this emphasis on collectivism. We can go back to Plato's Republic and we can see a profound Socratic philosophical thought experiment in determining the just ordering of society. A society which is not classless. Indeed, there is a rigid hierarchical class system in the Republic, but even that has its proto-communist traits too. We see in this imagined ideal society that for the ruling class, private property has been abolished. There are no nuclear families, and there is communal living and shared possessions, all in the service of wiping out selfishness. In addition to that, Plato conceived of a society that would be heavily censored. Art and poetry are suppressed and outlawed, and Homer's epics, which we will read together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Over the course of the summer season, we're going to be reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer's epics were banned. They were outlawed and considered dangerous. And there was also a belief in this imagined society that the truth can pose a threat to social harmony, and thus it was important to have a noble lie, which essentially sounds like authoritarian propaganda to me. Noble lies must be disseminated in order to keep social cohesion. So, as you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, are these really visions of utopia? Is this really the perfect society? And perhaps to some, these imagined societies may actually sound like a nightmare. And that takes us to an unnerving truth that would ultimately lead to the development of dystopian literature. One man's vision of utopia, one man's vision of heaven, is another man's vision of hell. And so much pain has been brought into the present day in service of the future, in service of a high, noble, supposedly utopian and utilitarian, idealistic future. Because indeed, how do you get from one state to the other? How do you get from your current situation to this projected and imagined society? Dystopian visions typically don't look all that different from utopian ones. What's good for the hive is good for the bee. But of course, if you know anything about beehives, you'll know that a few workers here and there are considered dispensable. The first recorded use of the word dystopia was from John Stuart Mill, whose essay on liberty is an absolutely indispensable read. And if you look at the etymology, you've got dys from the Greek, which means bad, diseased and abnormal, and then again you've got topos, meaning place, so it's a bad place. Utopia and dystopia are two sides of the same coin. Karl Popper would tell us that the utopian impulse is inherently dystopian, and blueprints for utopia inevitably lead to violence. In order to create a society significantly improved upon the present one, methods of control on behaviour are needed and are embraced. You have to figure out a way to get the people to do what you want, and this leads to political violence. It leads to compulsion, coercion, punishment and police state brutality. And to understand this and the development of real dystopias in the 20th century, we must go back to the mid-19th century to look at the rise of Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they put their inherently utopian thoughts into the Communist Manifesto in 1848, which is hands down the most damaging work that has ever been disseminated into the world. It has become a handbook for dictators with high utopian ideals and has ultimately led to the slaughter and starvation of millions in the 20th century. The common cry from those who profess to be in favour of Marxism is this: Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao and the Kim dynasty simply didn't implement communism properly. They didn't implement true communist ideals. What they did was a perversion, and communism works in theory. That's what people will say, though indeed no one has been able to point to any real-world examples where its supposed correct implementation on a nationwide level has not led to labour camps, famine and political executions. The thing is, there isn't a proper way to do it, to implement the thoughts of Marx. There are only interpretations of the work, because indeed Marx himself did not give a blueprint. He just supplied the capitalist critique, and his ethos is a short work and it's quite digestible, so it's worth rifling through yourself so you can make your own mind up. But the thing is, if millions have been killed in the name of supposed communism, then one cannot help but think of Christ's wisdom when he says that a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit, and you will know a man by his followers. Marxism contains the idea that capitalist production and competition are deeply flawed, and Marxism advocates for its destruction, the removal of the capitalist system. And remove that system and you begin the long walk to freedom and stability. The idea is you have yourself a good old-fashioned revolution, and then you make the state the sole owner of property and means of production. You do away with class division, comrade, and the noble, moral proletariat will march arm in arm into a utopian future. Marx would call for the working class, that's the proletariat, to rise up against the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. Because Marx and his followers see the world always and only in terms of struggles for power. And what do you do once you do away with class divisions? What you do is you establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which seems to be a contradiction in terms. That seems to be rather oxymoronic to me. Marx envisioned all of human history as fueled by class struggle, and you are either oppressed or you are the oppressor. Capitalism is exploitation because the bourgeoisie own the means of production, whilst the proletariat sells their labour in order to produce wealth for the owners of the means of production. The final goal of Marxism is communism, and the principle underlying that is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which is a fine idea in theory, but its execution has always been another matter. And in the wake of the Communist Manifesto, we start to see examples aplenty of just how disastrous its implementation, the implementation of communist ideals, ends up being. And then you see the writers of dystopian literature are keen to raise the warning bell around precisely this. Dystopian literature is like a strange descendant of Gothic literature, which itself burgeoned out of romance. Dystopian literature marched its way out of utopian literature, which itself also had a romantic and philosophical quality to it. And from the 19th century into the 20th century, we start to see the intertwining of science fiction and real-world politics shaping the dystopian genre. There is a really strong similarity in sentiments when it comes to the dystopian and the Gothic, because the Gothic is set in antiquated spaces, and though it is concerned with the past, it ultimately always teaches us something about the present. Dystopian literature is set in the future, but, like the Gothic, ultimately always contains a comment, and typically a fiercely satirical comment, always contains a comment about the present too. And indeed, we might consider that our present today was once a dystopian vision of the future in the past. But as we read these dystopian works, we should think carefully about the present as well as the future. What's the value of the dystopian genre? The value is this: the best way to try to avoid a hell is to show you a vision of it. That's what they're doing. That's what these writers are doing. These works are frequently dark and dismal in tone, understandably so. They're dark in substance too, but ultimately they have a positive aim. Dystopian writers are essentially saying, let's just evaluate for a moment. Let's evaluate where we are, how we got here, and where we're heading. And if our current course of action continues unchecked, what will society devolve into? Because indeed, we really don't want this vision of the future, and we don't want this one either. Fatima Vieira put it best when she said, dystopias that leave no room for hope fail in their mission. Their true vocation is to make man realise that since it is impossible for him to build an ideal society, then he must be committed to the construction of a better one. Here are the two fuels for dystopian literature in the 20th century. 1, totalitarianism. 2, scientific and technological progress, or the idea of advance. Now, in the previous century, readers were much more interested in the dystopias that explored totalitarian nightmare visions, which makes sense given what the 20th century looks like. But now, in the 21st century, I think we're going to see a rise in appreciation for dystopias that explore the ramifications of scientific and technological advance. We are in the AI generation, the generation of artificial intelligence. People are going to want to think about that and explore that. Indeed, Kazuo Ishiguro's recent Clara and the Sun shows this increasing preoccupation with that form of dystopia. But interestingly, we might ask, can literature even keep up with the technology? Because the gap is narrowing. You write a book positing a technological dystopia today, and it won't be 10 or 20 years before you seem outdated. Your work could well seem rather outdated by the end of the year, if not even quicker. It's really interesting to see just how much our outlook has changed over the last couple of centuries. The early Victorian era was an age of optimism where technological advance was seen with wonder. People used to go to Crystal Palace and see all the offerings, all the different innovations and inventions, and they were astonished, they were awed, oh, the possibility. But towards the end of the 19th century, we see that a Schopenhauerian pessimism and a Darwinian anxiety start to loom over the fin de siècle at the end of the century, giving rise to a new era of Gothic texts like Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which we will be reading around Halloween time later this year at the book club. Then we get to the Edwardian period, which is a really strange period because it kind of straddles two worlds. It's a bridge between Victorianism and Modernism. The Edwardian era was a transitional age from 1901 to 1910, and H.G. Wells called the Edwardian age the Age of Confusion. And it's interesting, we see in the last decade of the 19th century short stories like Jerome K. Jerome's The New Utopia, which is an early dystopian work, and Jerome envisioned a society 1,000 years into the future that has pursued the idea of absolute equality, or socialism, to its extreme. And in his Utopia, individuality and personal freedom have been sacrificed in the name of stability and state control. In his vision, citizens are indistinguishable from one another. They wear grey uniforms, they all have short black hair, and they live in glass houses in order to erase privacy. And private personal relationships have been abolished. In his utopia, that's actually a dystopia, majority rule reigns, because the majority, of course, inherently makes the correct decision. And so in his vision of hell, any minority or dissenting decision is incorrect and thus suppressed. Around the turn of the century, we see stories from H.G. Wells, who was seen as England's answer to Jules Verne, and they have some superficial similarities, of course, but their underlying ethos is quite different. We see H.G. Wells prolifically producing science fiction works, so many of which have now become classics, and Wells was probably the most deeply influential writer of the age. If you peer behind the curtain when it comes to Orwell or Huxley, you will find H.G. Wells. He influenced a whole generation of new writers in the early 20th century. Orwell, indeed, read everything H.G. Wells wrote, and then, later in life, he developed a fierce resistance to him, which we might see as a manifestation of what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence. Just as the term Orwellian would come to denote a totalitarian dystopia, the term Wellsian, before that, would refer to a well-ordered scientific dystopia. The four most iconic works by H.G. Wells were written in a 3-year span at the end of the 19th century. You've got The Time Machine, you've got The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is my personal favourite, you've got The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. And yes, there is a sense of fear in these works, and certainly people in the 20th century would find themselves driven mad when Orson Welles dramatised a series of fake news bulletins to bring the story of the War of the Worlds to life. People didn't realise it was just a dramatisation. They thought they were actually being invaded and ran out with pitchforks ready to take on the alien invaders. Although there is a sense of fear in Wells's works, I find that the science fiction of this era ultimately still contained a sense of wonderment and amazement rather than terror. So it was wonder before terror. There was still a sense of innocence and optimism about man's looking to the stars and looking to the future. And we see in many works, Wells is as eager to explore utopian visions as dystopian ones, though we cannot help but think of the line we walk between them. We see that in his 1905 A Modern Utopia, which explored the possibility of an idealised world state governed by an elite meritocracy, which he called the samurai. And Wells very much believed that scientific advance could not continue within the existing social and political structures. But by the time we get to the modern era, which I personally properly characterise as the time encompassing the two world wars, you get to a complete nightmare. The modern age was a hell like humanity had not seen before. This is how the world ends, T.S. Eliot would say, not with a bang, but a whimper. And Albert Camus called the 20th century the age of fear. That's so true. The 20th century was the most bloody and nihilistic period in all of recorded human history. This was an age of machine warfare. This was an age where men were sent to die in a muddy ditch, sent off like cannon fodder to be mown down, and en masse it seemed that humanity had convinced itself utterly and fully that God really was dead, as Nietzsche warned, and collectively that vacuum, that power vacuum, was filled up with bloodshed, warfare and death. What a meaningless period. This was very much a period of complete and utter chaos. And I find it interesting that the modern anxiety is best expressed in James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus, who said that he was trying to awake from the nightmare of history. I find that to be a sublime irony, because the real nightmare was unfolding before them and around them. They were in it. The early modern era today reads like a teaching tale, warning us against our Promethean questing after fire, warning us not to make these dangerous Faustian bargains. We did not heed the warning. Instead, we decided to split the atom and put it to work. Now let's talk about the book behind the two most iconic visions. Before Brave New World in 1984, there was Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, written in 1920. Zamyatin was a Russian writer living in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution in the oppressive USSR, who would see the rise of Stalin, under whose regime he would be blacklisted and denounced. And if you want a really deep dive into the climate of fear in that time and place, then please check out my video on Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. We also have a lecture series on that masterpiece that goes deep into Soviet censorship that is still available at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Zamyatin called this short work We. He called it both a serious work and a work of jest, and I find that to be a perfect summation, a great formula for dystopian literature generally. Before you even crack open the work, the title alone tells you about one of the most recurring preoccupations in dystopian writing. You see the emphasis on collectivism over individualism. This is a book in which we see what the victory of the many over the one looks like. Just like with utopian literature, this emphasis on collectivism, we see it time and again, and in the 20th century we see that Ayn Rand would unconventionally offer a defiant utopian image of the extreme opposite. She would show us visions of the future that embraced extreme individualism and rationalism and self-interest. She would give us visions in which the individual's pursuit of happiness was placed above all else. And she used her works like Anthem and Atlas Shrugged as a vehicle for her philosophy, Objectivism, which sprang out of Russian nihilism. But Yevgeny Zamyatin's We is a really experimental work. It's highly abstract and the prose is difficult and beautiful. The surface difficulty of this work has contributed to the fact that this is less read than it should be today. Anyone who's interested in Orwell or Huxley really should check this one out. And look, it's very slim. You could read that in a weekend. I love Zamyatin's stylistics because reading this feels like a jazz piece, or it feels like a mood piece. It feels like you're looking at little paintings in words. Zamyatin was writing in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he set his work hundreds of years into the future in a tyrannical one state. The dictator of his work, before Orwell's Big Brother, was the shadowy, nameless benefactor. And the citizens in his world are uniformed ciphers with numbers instead of names. The narrator is called D503. And the people are anonymous cogs in the machine, and they are constantly monitored by the Guardians. That's the secret police. And there is no love in this dystopia except for the state-mandated sex hour. Sexual activity is controlled, mechanized and bureaucratized. Food is synthetic and art is mundane. The music is machine-made. And we see in this story the narrator is seduced by a member of a rebel group, an underground group, who want to sabotage the totalitarian state. This is a common and recurring trope of dystopian literature that we see time and again. Love and lust finding a way amongst the oppression, and an underground rebellion rising up to fight the dictatorship. Zamyatin would say that this novel is a warning against the twofold danger which threatens humanity: the hypertrophic power of the machines and the hypertrophic power of the state. The thing is, in Stalin's USSR, communism was not just enforced in industry, but it was enforced in art too. Suddenly there were rules for artwork, rules for novels. You had to, if you were a writer, ultimately present a utopian ideal, a communist one, and elevate the proletariat. And so art became stifled, and many had to go underground and disseminate their works privately or not at all. Now, George Orwell would say that we had clearly and powerfully influenced Aldous Huxley's work, and Huxley very happily admitted that he read it and admired it. But Orwell saying that is perhaps just as telling, if not more telling, as to his own indebtedness, both to Zamyatin and to Huxley. Indeed, Huxley was a tutor for the young Eric Blair in Eton College, and you really can hear Orwell's anxiety of influence come through when he reviewed Brave New World more than a decade and a half prior to his novel. He expressed respect for Brave New World, but he said it simply did not address the brutality of totalitarian regimes like those of Hitler and Stalin. So let's talk about Brave New World. When you think of dystopian literature, you of course think of George Orwell's 1984, and just the name alone, Orwell, instantly throws up multiple strong concrete images of the writer, his work, and what he stands for. Even those who have not read 1984 have a really powerful notion of what Orwellian means. And yet, despite the fact in the West it could be said we're living much more fully in Huxley's vision, or at least we're in a hybrid that's more fully weighted towards Huxley's vision, the same associations and meanings don't arise when you say Huxley or Brave New World. Many don't really have an instant knee-jerk reaction as to what that means, which is strange because this was the first best-selling dystopian or anti-utopian novel. Here's how Will Self puts it, with his assertion that we are very much living in a Huxleyan, not an Orwellian dystopia. He said this back in 2017, but this is no less true today in 2025. Self would ask, are you suffering a life of constant deprivation at the moment? Only drinking bathtub gin that stinks and trying to light cigarettes where the tobacco is so dry that it falls out as you raise them to your lips? Or are your lives in fact characterised by instant gratification, usually by consumption of one sort or another? Huxley's novel is set in a futuristic world state, and the time is AF 632. In our calendar that is 2540 AD, and AF stands for after Ford, and yes, that is Ford, the car manufacturer. Huxley's trips to sunny California in the early part of the 20th century would fuel his anxiety of where society was headed, as he would rightly see America as setting the trends that the rest of the world would inevitably follow. And in the 1920s through the 30s, this was an era of American manufacturing. This was an era in which the assembly line dominated. People worked on the assembly line and then they went home and were consumers, consuming as though still on that assembly line. And in Brave New World we see that religion as we know it is gone. Nietzsche sounded the warning bugle for this in the 19th century. He would say that God is dead and we have killed him. And what he meant by that is, in an unenlightened, post-enlightenment world where the old systems of order and meaning are no longer present, an abyss would open up and a power vacuum would form, vying for our discipleship and worship. And in the 19th century, the new God would become science and technological advance. By the time we get to the 20th century, we start to see different gods atop that pedestal. We start to see people worshipping celebrity or people bowing down to politics. And indeed, by the time we get to the 21st century, we see celebrity and politics start to smash together. They start to fuse. And many would lament the unfortunate collision of education and entertainment. But in the 20th century, warfare would dominate. This was a time in which we saw the last bloody push for imperialism and empire before it would wane and bleed out. We saw a bloody scramble for power across Europe and Asia that saw the forces of nihilism and evil channeled into dictators that were giving rise to the feeling of the collective, the feeling of the nations. For the longest time, history was conceived of as circular, like an Ouroboros, like a snake eating its own tail. We would cycle through these distinct time shifts, and therefore reading history really could tell you something about the future. You could learn about history to see where you were going. The closer we get to the modern day, however, we start to see history defined in terms of progress, linear terms, as though we are marching towards something. Yevgeny Zamyatin would put forward a Hegelian Marxist dialectic by saying that history was ultimately a process driven by the conflict of opposing forces. Yesterday the thesis, today the antithesis, and tomorrow the synthesis. In Brave New World, we see that Huxley is expressing an anxiety of a world where the assembly line has become king. This is a world of mass production, homogeneity, and endless consumption. And we might think, well, what is so wrong about that? Well, with that comes, ultimately and perhaps inevitably, an erasure of identity, an erasure of individuality. With that consumption comes a sense of dehumanization, which of course comes with the automation of society. And again today, that fear has evolved to encompass artificial intelligence and the mass production of content. We continue to be passive consumers via the little lit up rectangle that we hold just a few inches from our eyeballs and which seems to be constantly affixed to everybody's hands. We are constantly consuming passively. And so in that sense, we've already got a small taste of Huxley's dystopia. In his world, Henry Ford's motor company has become the symbol, the anxious symbol of a machine-dominated society. Our Ford has replaced our father, and Ford's autobiography has become the people's Bible, in effect. And we see that the dawn of this new, improved and utopian society sprang from the mass production of the Model T automobile. The anxiety of the machine age would also be expressed sublimely at the end of Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator in 1940, in which he says, "We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. Don't give yourself to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men." In Brave New World, the fear of mass production's erasure of individuality has been taken to its absurd extreme. And we see that the very concept of natural conception is reviled. The idea of having a normal biological mother and father, and the idea of having a monogamous relationship, the idea of marriage, the idea of family has become abhorrent and disgusting, and instead humans are mass-produced in test tubes on assembly lines. Huxley here in this is exploring an idea that both terrified and fascinated him. He's exploring the idea of eugenics. We find that time and again in dystopian literature. The idea of selecting the specific traits you want in a population. People can do this today with the sex, they can do it with eye colour and hair colour, and we see of course a really extreme, macabre and sickening form of eugenics in the genocide of Hitler's Germany. And Aldous Huxley would have known about eugenics from his brother Julian, who was a leading researcher in the field. The Huxley family is a really interesting one. His grandfather was actually one of the main champions of Darwin's theory of evolution in the 19th century. So he's kind of like a scientist who happens to be a writer. In Brave New World, we see that the ova are fertilised by male gametes, and over the course of 36 hours, through something known as Bokanovsky's process, which is a fictional method of cloning, each embryo is budded to create 96 pairs of identical twins. And from there, for the lower echelons, they utilise a process that can yield thousands of identical brothers and sisters, all within a couple of years of each other. This is a world where there is very little variation among people. You've just got twins or triplets or whatever you would call them, clones, absolutely everywhere. The people in Brave New World look alike, they have the same handful of names, and they also think and act alike because they are conditioned to do so. And psychology was really taking off as an area of study across the 20th century and gradually becoming a more respected field akin to the sciences. And on the one hand, many writers found Freudian and Jungian psychoanalytical theories to be deeply informative when it came to understanding trauma, when it came to understanding neurosis, the unconscious and personality. But on the other hand, the field of psychology known as behaviourism was becoming feared. The area of psychology that's much closer to a science. Indeed, psychoanalysis has more in common with the arts, the humanities, and behaviourism is a science because it can produce replicable studies with controls and it can test hypotheses. We see some scorn and apprehension when it comes to behaviourism because indeed the madmen, the advertising executives on Madison Avenue were very much utilising what was being discovered in the field of behavioural psychology, and they were using such discoveries to influence people to buy their goods and to become consumers. The fear of conditioning, we see, would reach its most sublime expression in 20th century literature in Anthony Burgess's superbly Orwellian A Clockwork Orange. Anyway, the cloned, genetically and artificially produced offspring in Huxley's novel, we see, are subjected to conditioning through sleep hypnosis and relentless power of suggestion, and this is all in service of putting people in a predetermined class. We see in Brave New World there's a caste system, and the society is rigidly hierarchical, and the caste system breaks down like this. At the top of the chain you've got the alphas, and these are the leaders, thinkers and scientists of the world who are bred to be physically tall and attractive as well as intelligent. We see that the alphas dress in grey, and they have the least conditioning of all the different social rungs, and they are encouraged to think critically. They are the closest we get to unique individuals in this society because indeed a society does need some of those relatively free thinkers. Then in the next rung you've got the betas who dress in red. These are the skilled workers and they are trained to obey and not to challenge authority. After the betas you've got the gammas who are semi-skilled workers. They do the administrative work. They're the bureaucrats and machine operators, and they have average intelligence and limited powers of initiative. They dress in green and they are conditioned to enjoy mundane and routine tasks. Then you've got the deltas, and they are the ones who do the menial work. They are the labourers who are trained to follow orders unquestioningly. But not only that, they are also conditioned to hate books and nature, because indeed you can't very well be a passive consumer if you love art and the great outdoors, now can you? They dress in khaki, and then at the very bottom you've got the epsilons who dress all in black, and they really have no initiative, no autonomy, no freedom of thought at all. We can see Huxley's influence upon Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale when it comes to the state control of reproductive rights. Perhaps we also see a Huxleyan influence in my favourite Kazuo Ishiguro novel, Never Let Me Go. And The Handmaid's Tale, by the way, was published in 1985, so just 1 year after Orwell's grim Dystopia. This book is set in the Republic of Gilead, which is a patriarchal, totalitarian theocracy that has overthrown the US government. It is a Christian fundamentalist regime based on literal readings of the Old Testament, and they have replaced the US Constitution with scripture-based law. And all of this is enforced through surveillance. The secret police in Atwood's tale are referred to as the Eyes, and it's enforced through systematic terror. And one of the forces in Atwood's Dystopia, one of the forces behind the creation of Gilead was an ecological and fertility crisis, quite similar to the film Children of Men, very good film. And we see in her novel you have the handmaids, who are fertile women forced into sexual bondage to reproduce and bear children for the ruling elite. Interestingly, there's another influence behind Atwood and Orwell in the now less known and unfortunately less read novel Swastika Night, published in 1937 by Catherine Burdekin under the pseudonym Murray Constantine. Swastika Night is a powerfully feminist work, which was also an influence upon Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. This work presents a chilling fascist dystopia and an alternate history that imagines a world in which Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich has actually come to fruition. In this novel, we're taken 7 centuries after Nazi victory, where the Reich dominates the West and Japan, in alliance with Germany, dominates and controls the East after winning World War II. This is a fascinating novel because in this one we see that Hitler is deified and has become a godlike figure of worship, similar to Huxley's Ford. And in this novel, Hitler was said to have been a tall, blonde, superhuman born of a virgin. You can see that religion always exerts an effect. There's always a comment upon religion through its absence or its perversion in dystopian works. And in Swastika Night, all real history has been erased. And we see that one of the most disturbing aspects of this dystopia is its brutal patriarchy, in which we see women have been reduced to livestock, essentially. They're kept in camps and used solely for reproduction. All cultural diversity has been wiped out, books have been destroyed, and only Nazi propaganda and homogeneity remains. And we see in this novel, an Englishman meets a German who has preserved a secret book of forbidden knowledge containing the true history of Hitler. Once again, dystopias, those set in an imagined future, are eminently concerned with the past and the present. They express a fear that history is just a set of lies and cannot be trusted. Now, back to Brave New World with its caste system and its rigid hierarchy. Though we are not made on the factory floor today, the commentary about class in Huxley's work may actually sound a little too close to home for comfort, because indeed this is not too much of a stretch of the imagination, because society is hierarchical. Though Huxley was expressing anxiety fueled by America in the early 20th century, we must remember that he was British, he was an Englishman, and in his posited caste system, what he's doing is expressing post-Victorian anxiety about very real and oppressive class systems that are already in place. Even today, living in England, everybody has an inbuilt intuition when it comes to the class of others. It's this social baggage that follows you around that people try to navigate. The difference is, in our world today, there is great social mobility. In Huxley's dystopian vision, even the possibility of upward advance has been removed, and that is terrifying. Surely in his world there would be outcry about this. This is unfair. People have been conditioned from birth to be epsilons, lowly epsilons. No, there is no outcry. Because not only are the people conditioned to be happy in their servitude, they also have a range of pharmaceutical tools to keep them content and placated. The citizens of Huxley's world state are kept placated and sedated and peaceful by a happiness-inducing drug called soma. Used in conjunction with the hypnopedia, the sleep brainwashing, this is a really powerful, subduing force. Huxley was writing almost 100 years ago, before the contraceptive pill, before IVF, before the free love movement, before widespread accessibility of pornography, and before all of this, he was exploring the dark side of consumerism, which was just taking off. And he was exploring what would be the outcome if artificial happiness was the norm. Would that not rob us of our humanity? If everyone was walking around elated, but in a medicated haze, what would we lose? And again, it sounds very prescient. I know in America, a quarter of people are on antidepressants, and I think those who are not, many of them are self-medicating with other substances. What do we lose if we're happy all the time and have no troubles, no woes? Well, we lose our individuality. We lose our autonomy and freedom. We lose our liberty. We lose everything that makes life worth living, because all of this requires hardship. We need difficulty and struggle. We need obstacles to overcome, and we need to make sacrifices. We need dilemmas. We need to be able to choose between good and evil, or indeed the lesser of the two evils. We, as humans, need to wrestle with our consciences, that inner voice within us, which many define as God. And we need to feel a sense of progress. We can't just be there. We can't just inhabit utopia without a vision of a better future. If progress has been fulfilled and utopia is already here, then ultimately we're actually just in hell. As Dostoevsky would say, if man had utopia, he would burn it down in a day. Now, in order to emphasize this message, because indeed Huxley gives us novels of ideas, just like Dostoevsky, Huxley uses his characters as mouthpieces, and in Brave New World we see our central protagonists, the psychologist and strange alpha plus Bernard Marx, and we see Lenina Crown, who is a beta hatchery worker. She works in the fertilization plants which are set up for mass manufacturing of genetically controlled babies. We see our protagonists take a vacation outside of the world state to what is known as a savage reservation in New Mexico, where they can observe natural-born people who are subject to aging and disease, and they get to see different cultures. In their homogeneous society, all culture has been abolished. The savages are born naturally, and they live in accordance with ancient customs, and so they have become an anthropological phenomenon. Indeed, Huxley was writing during a time in which there were still human zoos, and so what he was writing was really close to the present reality rather than a proposed future many centuries on. The fact that the natural born are referred to as savages is a hark back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's romantic philosophizing at the turn of the Enlightenment and his idea of the noble savage. Rousseau, and indeed the Romantic poets, would see the condition of humanity in nature and not within the strictures of society as the most noble one, the one in which we are most content, the most agreeable one. Man is born free, as Rousseau would write in the opening to The Social Contract, but everywhere he is in chains. The term savage is a deliberate archaism that also reminds us of the Renaissance era's expansion, imperialism and colonialism. The title of Huxley's book, as you may know if you recently read Shakespeare's The Tempest with us at the book club, is an allusion to Miranda's speech, who is raised on an island by her exiled mage and wizard father. It's her speech when she sees the colonialists wash up on shore. She says, "Oh wonder, how many goodly creatures are there here. How beauteous mankind is, O brave new world. that has such people in it. Now, of course, the irony in Shakespeare's play is that the colonists who turn up, who were inspired by very real explorers taking an excursion to the so-called New World, they are in fact just a bunch of immoral, scheming, backstabbing drunkards who are very keen to subjugate the land and bring back one of its natives, Caliban, to Europe for financial gain. This is one of the few instances in which people are much more likely to associate the phrase Brave New World with this book rather than the speech it originally alludes to. On the Savage Reservation, we get to meet a character called John the Savage. He becomes a central protagonist too, and John is an outsider caught tragically between worlds. He was born naturally on the Savage Reservation, but he is the son of an alpha and a beta from the world state. And though he grew up among the so-called savages, he's never fully accepted by them. His mother taught him to read using the complete works of Shakespeare, and so he uses works like The Tempest, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, and Romeo and Juliet to think. He thinks and speaks in Shakespeareanisms, which of course we all do, even if we don't realise it. And John the Savage's learning to think and speak from and through Shakespeare is most likely reminiscent for many readers of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The monster is an artificially made being who feels human, all too human, in a world where man is the real monster. And to get a real feel, to get a grounding for dystopian literature, one inevitably finds themselves going back to Mary Shelley. Again, you can see the development of the form as a combination of corrupted utopian literature or anti-utopian literature, gothic romance with a charming dash of satirical travel literature thrown in the mix. Now, Mary Shelley also wrote a tremendous novel called The Last Man, which is a proto-dystopian apocalyptic novel considered by many to be one of the earliest examples of science fiction, and in that work we see the world has been devastated by a plague that has wiped out almost all of humanity. And we might consider the fact that George Orwell had originally titled 1984 The Last Man in Europe. What we have in Frankenstein is a repackaging of the Prometheus story, and to deep dive into that you can check out our lecture at the book club, or you can check out the Hardcore Literature podcast episode on Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. The story that we return to time and again is the story of the fall. We spoke about that earlier this year when we read 100 Years of Solitude, and more recently when we read The Sound and the Fury. We constantly return to the Genesis story, the fall of mankind, in different ways. This is the story we see in Goethe's Faust, and it finds its expression in the postmodern era in Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. The Genesis story and the Prometheus story, and indeed the story of Daedalus and Icarus flying too close to the sun, is a warning about the dangers of pride. It is a warning to not aspire too high, because the higher you fly, the more severe your fall when things go wrong. It's this warning that we get in the dystopian works that emphasise the scientific advance side of their hellish vision. We'll get to the totalitarian side in a moment. The quest for enormous advance necessitates that some will be oppressed or excluded or punished or exiled or left behind. And we see, in Brave New World, when John the Savage sees the world state, his initial awe lapses into despair, because this is a world without everything that makes life worth living for him. It's a world without hardship, which therefore means a world without joy and bounty and nourishment. Here's what we get when one of the controllers of the world state answers John the Savage's question as to why they don't let the people watch plays like Othello. He says, because our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make flivvers without steel. That's an automobile metaphor. A flivver is a cheap car. And you can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now. People are happy, they get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off, they're safe, They're never ill, they're not afraid of death, they're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age. They're plagued with no mothers or fathers. They've got no wives or children or lovers to feel strongly about. They're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave, and if anything should go wrong, there's Soma, which you go and chuck out the window in the name of liberty, Mr. Savage. Liberty, he laughed, expecting deltas to know what liberty is, and now expecting them to understand Othello. The Savage was silent for a little. All the same, he insisted obstinately, Othello's good. Othello's better than those feelies. The feelies in Brave New World are sensory-enhanced entertainment, kind of like films, but they stimulate the tactile sense, touch. They allow the audience to physically feel what the characters are feeling, and that's a great metaphor right there. This is a world in which sensation is prized over depth, physical feeling, rather than deep introspection, reflection, thought and meditation. And if you live in a world of surface impressions, then how can you access deep emotional feeling? The thing is, we don't want to watch a movie to physically feel what the characters are feeling. We want to feel their emotions. Deep down inside, we want to connect to them, and we want to feel a range of emotions. So Othello's better than those feelies, and the controller says, of course it is. But that's the price we have to pay for stability. You've got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. We have the feelies and the scent organ instead. But they don't mean anything, John the Savage says. They mean themselves. They mean a lot of agreeable sensations to the audience. But they're told by an idiot. So we get another Shakespearean allusion, an allusion to Macbeth, which you'll know all about if you just read William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury with us. And if you just read Chaucer with us, you'll have thought about the relationship between entertainment and deep meaning. This is something that you'll want to bring into Brave New World, because indeed you've got to have both, but if deep meaning's the most important thing, then you've got to have some entertainment in service of it. You've got to make the message you want to impart at least a little bit agreeable, don't you? So in Brave New World, this is a world without Shakespeare, and this is a world without the Holy Bible, because there isn't a formal religion. Though indeed we might think that in communist and socialist dystopian hellholes, the state takes the form of the religious figurehead. And David Foster Wallace would warn us in his sublimely Burgessian and Orwellian Infinite Jest, a phenomenal novel that we have a lecture series for as well at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. This is a work that's also indebted to Brave New World. David Foster Wallace would warn us that it is an illusion, a delusion and a lie that you can worship nothing and be in service of nothing. You always worship something, and in Brave New World, the worship is hedonistic consumerism and pleasure, and of course scientific advance too. Progress is worshipped and put above all else. So there's no Shakespeare, there's no Bible, there's no great works of psychology like William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, I say it's a world without these books, but of course the higher-ups, they have libraries. They have these books, they know all about these books. So the elites have their little libraries. It's just the masses, the unwashed plebs who cannot read, they're not allowed to read. That's too dangerous. We see again another recurring trope in dystopian literature is censorship and the banning or burning of books. We see that most glaringly in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Books are burnt, not read. And again, this is a trope that doesn't come purely from imagination, but has real-world precedent and is influenced by things happening in the real world. Ray Bradbury looked on during a time of Nazi book burnings, Stalinist suppression, and in his own country, McCarthyist witch hunts. And he penned a nightmare that wasn't really a stretch from what was actually happening in the real world. And when one notices those parallels, one cannot help but think of Heinrich Heine's warning that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people too. One reads Huxley's Brave New World, and if you are a sensitive reader and thinker, which you undoubtedly are if you are watching this video, because this is a deep, long-form video. This is a thoughtful discussion about the power of visionary literature. This is not short form, this is not frivolous and dispensable. When you're watching this and you're engaging with me, you are not obsessively doom scrolling like a junkie searching for the next hit of dopamine, the next fix of serotonin. If you're a sensitive reader, then Brave New World is funny. It's of course satirical, glaringly so. There's a satirical comment upon the present day and perennially human phenomenons. It's very perceptive as a work. You read this book, but then when you think about the logical run-on, when you take the reductio absurdum to its extreme, then when you do that, Brave New World probably terrifies you. And maybe you arrive at the same conclusion as John the Savage. Let's keep death and aging and depression. Let's keep degradation, decay and disease. Let's keep hardship and deprivation, lack and despair, because unless we do away with Shakespeare, we do away with high art, great music, beautiful painting, we do away with all the joys of being human, complex thoughts and rousing emotions, emotional connection. We don't just read to think, we read to feel, we engage deeply. And the great thing about reading great literature is it is both sublimely solitary and marvellously, beautifully communal too. We are talking to each other across time when we read these great books. And indeed, of late I've had some difficulties. I've had some health difficulties here and there, and there's been some challenges to overcome, and yet I would not do away with them. I would not want a world without these challenges and hardships, because then it would be a world without meaning too, because I've had a lot of meaning too. I've had a lot of joyful experiences of late, and you've got to have the dark in order to have the light. You need both of them. I think about how modern philosopher Robert Nozick conducted a thought experiment in which he hypothesized that if one could program their life and get into an experience machine, they could program their perfect life and get in and switch off and just depart from the actual world and live their perfect ideal life. He concluded that most people would ultimately not choose to get into the tank, because a real life with all its hardship and difficulty is much more preferable, much more favourable than a fake but perfect life. In the words of John the Savage, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. And I want sin. And he's told, well then you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, the Savage said defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what might happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, said the Savage at last. But now, let's go from one dystopia to another very different dystopia. And this is the dystopia that, as we said, typically comes to mind when we even think of dystopia. When we say the word dystopia, we typically think of Orwell's 1984. And now we're moving from a dystopia of progress to a dystopia of dictatorship. And George Orwell would say, every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. Orwell would say that every scientific advance speeds up the trend towards nationalism and dictatorship. So that's where his interest lied primarily. And he gifted us 1984, which has become a dark mirror for all ages. Each generation sees themselves contorted and distorted in it. The terms 1984, Orwellian, Big Brother, thought crime, thought police and doublethink have become bywords. They've entered common parlance, and people do not even have to have read this book to understand what all of that means. These are words that express the anxiety of living in a police state and living in a surveillance state. And even those who haven't read the book probably do know something of the central protagonist, Winston Smith. They probably know something of the 2 Minutes Hate. They probably recognise the term Room 101. The book has become legend, but as always, it is fascinating to go back to the original source and read it through yourself, to read it attentively. And though we might say that in the West, Aldous Huxley's vision is the one that has more prominently come to fruition, there are many places in the world today in which it absolutely is Orwell's hell and not Huxley's that the people are living through. What you find when you return to 1984 or engage with it for the first time is an extraordinary work of science fiction with really powerful world building. It's also written with the bitterness and acerbic, ironic tone that you could only find from a writer who was on his deathbed, and George Orwell was. This is a deathbed book. He would die from tuberculosis just 1 year after publication. This is pristine science fiction, written in prose so clean you could eat off it. And the reading experience is both immersive and estranging. The feeling of defamiliarization bludgeons you upside the head from the very first iconic line. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And it has been observed that the title of this novel is an inversion of Orwell's actual time. If you read the book not as 1984, but as 1948. Indeed, it was published the following year. If you read it as 1948, then what you get is a damning critique of Orwell's post-war Britain, which was a climate of deprivation, hardship, poverty, and increasing paranoia of surveillance, censorship, and propaganda. And it was a climate in which the people were aware of the increasingly totalitarian leaning of the world from having fought some very real-world oppressive and repressive regimes. Huxley has the world state, whereas Orwell has Oceania. And 1984 takes place in a not too distant future, just 3 decades on from Orwell's time. Orwell was thinking about the future that his son might live in. His son would have been in his early to mid-30s in this future. So we see the anxiety explored in this book is the anxiety of what world will I live my children and my grandchildren. It's interesting, Winston Smith, the central protagonist, is not quite sure if it's 1984. He thinks it could be, but honestly, who really knows? Now, the book actually takes place sometime on after 1984. There is an appendix at the back of the work that you are implored to turn to very early on in the novel. It's up to you as a reader whether you read the appendix first or you wait till the end, but either way, that appendix brings a glimmer of hope, and it gives us an optimistic frame narrative. The appendix is on the rules of newspeak, which is the tyrannical government's new oppressive language, and yet this appendix is written in a tone of historical observation and detachment. And of course it's written with great liberty. The writer has the liberty, the freedom to actually comment upon this totalitarian government. The implication, therefore, is that we are actually a bit further out in time than 1984, and the totalitarian hell has been, but is now gone. So that's the thing about even the darkest dystopias, they have to contain a glimmer of hope. The main story is set in the near future in which the world is at perpetual war. And again, this is a commentary on Orwell's contemporary time, because indeed Brits of Orwell's time had precious few memories of times in which they were not at war. So you had the First World War from 1914 to 1918. Orwell, who had been born in British-ruled India near the turn of the century and who would work in the police force in Burma, he was entering adolescence as the First World War kicked off. Now, World War I had been called the Great War, and there was a great patriotic and propaganda-fueled push for the youths of Europe to sign up and fight. And you had young men all across the lands setting out with great optimism and a great sense of heroism, thinking that they would be back in Blighty before Christmas and they would win the war. There was a great sense of optimism, and no one knew the reality of the abject hell that they were actually going to face. World War I was one of the most pointless and senseless wars in human history, and it was the first real machine war. An estimated 15 million were killed. They were either slaughtered by machine gun fire, mown down like cannon fodder, or they were killed by disease in the trenches. At the very start of World War I, you see great poets like Wilfred Owen. They're filled with optimism. But when they see the reality, their poetic outpouring starts to take a very dark turn. Here's Wilfred Owen. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It is just and sweet to die for your country. That's the old lie, the propaganda. We see that many who returned from that war, and indeed many actually did not return, and those who did return were often both physically and mentally maimed. Those who returned from that war couldn't possibly talk about what they had endured. That was the thing, people didn't talk about it. That was the case for J.R.R. Tolkien, who was at the Battle of the Somme. He never spoke about what he endured, though we find visions of hell in battle in his fantasy masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, and we see a deep concern with good versus evil that clearly came from his real lived experience. Now, after World War I, there was a sense that the people had been lied to, and they had been. And so, come 1939, seeing Germany under Adolf Hitler boot stamp its way across Europe, and England, that absolutely positively did not want to go to war again, found itself forced to declare war on Germany. I cannot emphasise enough just how much another war was not wanted. This was completely different from the First World War and how that kicked off. Neville Chamberlain would try and desperately find any other recourse apart from war. He tried so desperately to stop the country from going into the hell that it was hurtling towards, and he would ultimately fail in that endeavour. The German dictator was adamant and committed to his course of imperial expansion. And at this time, this was an impoverished and resentful Germany, a Germany that had experienced hyperinflation as a result of the First World War. Not only were they economically crushed, but they also felt humiliated by the enforced treaty at the end of the First World War, and they were committed to implementing their utopian ideals. This is how we see that utopian impulses and dystopian ones are much the same thing, as Karl Popper would tell us. The ideals of Nazi Germany were nationalistic, totalitarian, bloodthirsty, repressive, suppressive, and genocidal. Given the enormous disillusionment after the First World War, the Second World War would not be referred to as great, but became known as the People's War. And if people thought that the death toll of the First War couldn't be topped, they were seriously wrong. An estimated 70 to 85 million people would die during the Second World War, including not only the slaughter of military personnel on the battlefield, but also the Holocaust of 6 million Jews. And indeed, the greatest number of deaths were clocked in country of totalitarian communist regimes. The people living in such regimes were slaughtered by their own governments. We're talking about not only the murder toll at the hands of fascist Germany, but we're talking, of course, about the deaths by government-engineered famine and execution in Stalin's Soviet Union. And, of course, we also see an enormous death toll in Mao's communist China after the war too. Prior to writing 1984, Orwell had begun to exorcise the demons of communism in his political satire and beast allegory Animal Farm, which is so short and digestible that I would actually recommend picking it up and reading it alongside 1984. In Animal Farm, Orwell lampooned the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union under Stalin. He offered a critique of revolutionary ideals and the dangers of totalitarianism. The pig who seizes power, Napoleon, is a thinly veiled stand-in for Stalin. You've also got Trotsky in there, and the philosophy of animalism is, of course, communism. And you probably know that sublime, nonsensical maxim that goes like this: all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Now, Orwell's political thoughts had clarified after he went over to Spain to fight in the Civil War, just before the Second World War kicked off. His involvement in the revolution would be one of the most decisive events of his life. He travelled over there to fight against fascism, joining the Republican coalition of left-wing socialist, communist and anarchist groups who opposed Francisco Franco's dictatorial regime, which was in support of Hitler's Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascist Italy. Orwell saw it as his duty to support democracy and workers' rights. And he had a steadfast belief in the virtue of the proletariat, who he thought were uncorrupted by the lust for power. And yet, participating in the fighting in Spain with a Trotskyite Marxist militia shattered some of his illusions. He also ended up wounded by a sniper's bullet to the throat, but he was disillusioned when he was able to observe the infighting and counter-revolutionary acts of the Communist Party in Spain firsthand, something that Gabriel Garcia Marquez would note in his 100 Years of Solitude over in Latin America and in his exploration of tyranny. All revolutions end up looking much the same. They're the same thing over and over again, just different geographical locales. Orwell would return from Spain, finding himself more emphatically despising Stalinism and totalitarianism generally. Orwell would ultimately hold out hope for a form of English democratic socialism for his country, which he thought had yet to be properly implemented. And funnily enough, we see, satirically and ironically, he makes the political ideology of the totalitarian one-party state of 1984 INGSOC, which stands for English socialism. But though he had initially been in support of Labour, Orwell swiftly found himself disillusioned with the Labour Party that took government post-World War II in a landslide after years of Tory dissatisfaction, and Orwell would say that he ultimately didn't believe that Labour were that different from the Conservative Party. They both had the same corruption and thirst for power. Now, we see from 1945 to 1951 that Britain would become significantly more socialist under Clement Attlee's government, which was driven by a widespread desire to rebuild after the war and to have a fair and just society. This resulted in massive cultural reshaping. We see the creation of the welfare state. We see the National Health Service was created in 1948, providing free at point of entry universal healthcare paid by taxation. The rationale underpinning the creation of the NHS was that healthcare is a public right and should not be a private commodity. The country also saw the nationalisation of many key industries like the railway, electricity, gas, iron and steel and coal, along with a huge expansion in the building of public housing. The increased social security net was a positive effect for many ordinary people, and the widespread accessibility of housing and healthcare would prove to be profoundly important. But we also see that this was a time of great economic hardship too. Wartime rationing, we see, continued well into the 1940s and 50s, which meant that this was a time of austerity, and living standards were modest at best for almost everyone, and luxuries were scarce. You really didn't have many luxuries. We also see that top tax rates soared to over 90%. It got to 97.5% on investments and 80 to 90% for income, and the rates remained in this range up to the 1970s. Now, these taxes were designed to fund both the welfare state and to pay off war debt, because Britain was in significant debt, most powerfully indebted to the US. What was the overall impact of all of this? Stability and security, but prosperity would not come until some years after Orwell's death. And whilst nationalisation meant increased stability, we also see an increase in bureaucracy too, which Orwell would satirise in his work. And a patriotic sense of doing your national duty, for many, would steadily lapse into a growing feeling of dissatisfaction. So in 1948, Orwell's Britain was a pretty grey, drab, deprived and impoverished land, even though the country was headed in a more optimistic direction. And of course you have the baby boom from 1946 onwards, which was like a collective sigh of relief with the cessation of the war. But this still was, as we said, a time of rationing. That's why we see Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory written in the 60s, but with memories of harder times. There was something brilliant about a bar of chocolate, and chocolate used to be much better than the rubbish that is peddled today. A bar of chocolate was a real luxury that you couldn't just have every day. That was a real treat for all the family. So we see luxuries were scarce, and people would be eating tins of spam, they'd be eating boiled cabbage, they'd be smoking rolled up cigarettes and drinking cheap gin. In addition to this drabness, there was a fear amongst at least half of Britons that a Third World War was looming and inevitable. You had enormous anxiety about the atom bomb. Not only had Britons lived through the Blitz and the German bombings on home territory, not only had they seen the destruction of their metropolises by the V2 rockets, but the world had seen the US display what nuclear weaponry could do when they dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this wasn't just about ending the war in the wake of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In Europe, Germany had already surrendered. The Führer had committed suicide in a blown-out bunker in Berlin, and the US had swooped in to scoop up the top Nazi scientists for NASA. This wasn't just about ending the war in Asia, this was about sending a warning message to the Soviet Union. And thus we see how wars never really stop, they just roll into one another, they roll into another form of war, and thus we see the age of the Cold War began. That's what Vietnam was all about. That's also what the space race was all about. The race to the moon was really a proxy war in lieu of a hot conflict. And that's what trade wars are all about too. They're in effect Cold Wars. So in Orwell's Britain, you have impoverished people living in fear of annihilation and having recently fought totalitarianism and feeling very much under the control of the state. And this is how you read 1984, not as a prescient warning of what could be in the future, but more of a reflection of what already is in the present, or what was in the past. So, in 1984, the world is at perpetual war, and Britain is now called Airstrip 1, which has become a province of the totalitarian superstate known as Oceania, which includes the Americas, Australasia and South Africa. Oceania is one of three ruling superstates, the other two being Eurasia, which is Russia and the former Soviet Union, and Europe aside from the British Isles, and East Asia, which of course includes China, Japan, Korea, and the Southeast Asian countries. Though indeed, the true reality of the world and the territories at war is not exactly what the party would have the proles believe. This is something we will explore in depth in the Hardcore Literature Book Club lectures, as there are many fascinating theories and some deep lore in the world building of 1984. As Orwell was convalescing in bed, he saw the Western nations form NATO, and he saw Russia detonate its first atomic bomb, and he saw Mao Zedong establish the People's Republic of China. This division of the world into three superstates seems to be a wry, ironic commentary on how much of the world was divided up post-World War II. We also get further satire in the comment that Oceania's enemy today was once their ally, and their ally today was once their enemy, although the state makes sure that people don't remember that. As far as they are concerned, their current enemy has always been their enemy. They've never been friends before, but Winston Smith, in the dim recesses of his memory, knows that this isn't true. You have that with the West's relationship with Russia. Russia, which has historically been an ally, but we're told is also constantly and perennially the West's enemy. And interestingly, Russia was one of the Allied forces in World War II, but people conveniently forget that they were actually united with the Axis powers at the very beginning. Russia was in cahoots with Nazi Germany, and they were scheming as to how they might divide up Poland after the war. And indeed, once Russia became allies and fought against Nazi Germany, at the end of the war, we see that the US, Russia, France and the UK got to divide up Germany into 4 occupation zones, with the East controlled by Russia and West Germany controlled by the other allies, and the Soviet Union would annex multiple countries and territories too. In 1984, we see a divergence in the timeline and an alternate history, as whilst in Orwell's day the people feared a Third World War, in this story, in this future, the Third World War has already been, and multiple atomic bombs have been dropped across Europe and America and Asia, and we're now living in the wake. We're now living in the bombed out apocalyptic dystopia. In 1984, rather than be conditioned, dulled and placated by pleasure, the populace are kept under control by the might of the government's boot. There is no joy here. It is bleak and depressing and disturbing, and Oceania is led by Big Brother, which is really just an abstract idea personified. It is the image, Big Brother is the image at the front of the shadowy, dictatorial one-party state, and the mustachioed image of Big Brother and the cult of personality that follows is everywhere and is a direct recall of the propaganda posters of Stalin. The party is a nefarious, omnipresent force, and citizens of Oceania are under surveillance 24/7 by virtue of the two-way telescreens that are in their homes, and there are cameras everywhere. And if you do anything against the party politics, you will very swiftly find yourself disappeared in the dead of night and promptly forgotten about by everyone. If you read the beginning of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, with the nighttime arrests and the atmosphere of neighbours informing on one another, you will find a pretty direct, comparable parallel. From 1984 we get this: it was always at night. The arrests invariably happened at night, the sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round the bed. In the vast majority of cases there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. And those who have read about the Cultural Revolution in China, nearly 2 decades after the publication of Orwell's book, or indeed those who have grandparents who lived through such times, will probably also recognise the fervour, the fear and the zealotry of the populace in George Orwell's novel, because in Orwell's London we see that citizens gather daily for the communal 2 minutes of hate, and we see that the party traitor and principal enemy, Emmanuel Goldstein, who wrote a book called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, which is referred to just ominously as the book. We see that Goldstein appears on these big communal telescreens, and the people unleash their hatred. They cry and wail and curse violently. They violently rail against this traitor of the party, just like Big Brother himself. Goldstein may have once been an individual, but he is now very much a type, an archetypical enemy, designed to unite the people together, united in a common hatred. And the 2 minutes of hate will remind many of the struggle sessions in Mao's China. The markers of totalitarianism are everywhere in Orwell's Dystopia. Political philosopher and historian of totalitarian states, Hannah Arendt, in her landmark work, The Origins of Totalitarianism from 1951, identified several key markers of such dictatorships. You've got a system of terror. That's the tool of governance. Systematised terror. Police states keep the populace in fear, using the threat of the rod to enforce obedience. Again, this is why Karl Popper said that utopian thought inherently contains dystopian thought. Because what do you do when you've got to actually enforce your ideals? Totalitarian states want constant fear, and they want to induce total dependence upon the state, and so they will create common enemies. We see this today even in so-called democratic systems. We see the creation of common enemies to keep the people distracted from what really matters. Hannah Arendt would say the chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. He can never admit an error. Mass leaders in power have one concern, which overrules all utilitarian considerations: to make their predictions come true. Compare that with this line from 1984. If all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party's slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past. Other markers of totalitarianism include the heavy reliance upon propaganda and the systematic destruction of truth. And the iconic propaganda slogans in 1984 stare out at us very early on in the novel. We're told, war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Winston Smith. And that's a great name, isn't it? Because it is at once ironically reminding Orwell's readers of the heroic wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, but of course this character is anything but courageous, whilst also simultaneously the name being used, the surname, is one of the most common in England. Smith. Winston Smith lives in Victory Mansions, which again is an irony, and we think about how history is written by the victors, and there is nothing victorious or glorious about these run-down socialist apartment blocks. Winston Smith works for the Ministry of Truth, which I contend was inspired by the BBC. Orwell spent some years working in radio broadcasting for the publicly funded state media, and he came up against their censorship and propaganda. You've got the Ministry of Truth, which ironically rewrites history to fit the party's predictions and erases history that is not favourable to the party's politics. That's what Winston does all day at work. And then you've got the Ministry of Peace, and the real function of that is to promote war. You've got the Ministry of Love, which brainwashes, represses and tortures those who commit the heinous thought crime. And then you've got the Ministry of Plenty, which is responsible for the endless wartime rationing, leaving the citizens in a state of severe and sustained deprivation. So Orwell is lampooning the bureaucratising of British society, in which you're told one thing does one thing when in fact it does quite the opposite. So totalitarian markers are propaganda, systematic fear, mobilising the masses, because in totalitarian states the cogs in the machine en masse are indispensable, even though the individual worker drones will of course die and some of them will be brutalised. You've got all of that, and then you've got ideological absolutism. So a totalitarian state is just like a cult. Nazi Germany was obsessed with racial purity, the idea of the Aryan race. In Stalin's Soviet Union, it was all about the class struggle and the noble proletariat marching arm in arm to a utopian future. And in these states, you've also got an elimination of individuality, and you've got a situation, you've got a state where ideology replaces truth. In 1984, you've got this idea. If the party says that 2 plus 2 equals 5, then it is so. Now, this phrase is a really powerful exemplum of authoritarian control, tyranny and gaslighting, and it's been in common parlance since the 1930s or thereabouts, and rose out of Soviet Russia. Indeed, this phrase was referring specifically to Joseph Stalin's 5-year plan. This slogan essentially says that the 5-year plan will be completed in 4 years. With hard work, 2 plus 2, 2 years equal 5. We'll get there a year earlier. Now, Stalin's 5-year plans were a series of economic plans with the goal, the aim of transforming the USSR from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower. And the state set very strict economic targets in regards to production and costs with no reliance on market forces, and success was measured in quantitative, not qualitative terms. So you had to hit those quotas by any means necessary. Now, the reality of all this was the brutal destruction of peasant farms by the collective state farms. And when millions of the peasantry resisted, these were the wealthy peasants, they would be labelled the kulaks. They were made the enemy, the common enemy of the state, and they were systematically and brutally executed, deported, jailed, or they would die in famines. And the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, ended up killing millions. Now, we see in George Orwell's 1984 that the people of Airstrip 1 are ludicrously on their 9th 3-year plan. And any news of success that comes to the proletariat, like we've just had a victory in a war, in a battle, we've just been victorious, any good news is very swiftly followed on by announcements of harsher rationing and deprivation. In 1984, Orwell would say that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Now, if you're not allowed to say that, if you have to say 2 plus 2 equals 5, then you are not free. One of the most terrifying ideas at the centre of 1984 is George Orwell's exploration of censorship and suppression of speech and writing. Now, of course, as a writer, he very much values the written word, and the point of writing is to have the freedom to put what you think and believe down on paper. George Orwell has written extensively on why he writes. He has a great essay called exactly that, Why I Write. But 1984 I take to be a much more fully fleshed out exploration of exactly why he writes, and indeed any writer writes, and what writing, freedom to write, means to him. We say we want the freedom to speak. We want the freedom to say what we believe, and we want the freedom to write what we believe. But it isn't just about that. It isn't just about writing and speaking. It's about thinking too, because very often we don't actually know what we think until we speak or write about it. Take it from someone who's done a lot of speaking. We have almost 700 long-form lectures at the Hardcore Literature Book Club in the back catalogue at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Long-form podcasts and videos, and I've done a lot of speaking over the years. And what I have found is when you speak on a topic, you're taking a leap of faith, and you have the faith that those who are listening to you will follow your train of thought and think through the proposition with you, and they'll question and they'll explore and they'll make discoveries along the way. We're in it together. As you speak, there's something extraordinary happening in real time. It's dynamic, it's exciting, you're weighing and balancing, you're exploring all the pockets and nuances of the proposition you're putting forth. Yeah, you're playing a little bit too. You're trying to arrive at what you believe. You're thinking things through out loud. And this is something that I do all the time. I need to speak in order to think, which can get a bit frustrating if you're around me, because I very much am speaking what's going on in here in real time. Engagement with literature is just thinking. And you can write around the great books, you can journal, you can keep marginalia, you can write in the margins. As you are doing so, you're entering into a great conversation with these writers across time, but also with yourself. And when you read these great books, you're discoursing on the great themes of the human condition. What is love? Why do people go to war? What does it mean to be a man or a woman or a person of this nationality, this time, this culture? What does it all mean? Indeed, what's the meaning of life itself? This is what we're talking about when we read, when we write, when we engage with the great books. And reading is about deepening the human experience. And just like Shakespeare's protagonists and Chaucer's characters, we change by virtue of overhearing ourselves speaking. We speak, we hear ourselves, and then we reevaluate. It's iterative, or indeed we change by listening to another, just like Cervantes' characters in Don Quixote. Entering into a discussion in good faith, which is really what you're doing when you're reading, is saying that you're going to listen, you're going to truly listen. To listen to another, you have to seek to understand them before you make yourself understood, as Stephen Covey would teach us. When you read a great book, you're paying attention to what the writer is saying. You're not making your mind up until you've heard them out and thought it through. And this is a really sublime way, probably the best way, of growing intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Having the freedom to read and write and speak is amazing. It is probably the most important liberty of all. So no wonder totalitarian states that want to exert control over their populace also want to stop them thinking. And how can you stop them thinking? Stop them writing. Yeah, that's how you do it. Stop them writing and you stop the thought, because the pen is mightier than the sword. If people are allowed to think freely, then they might come to the conclusion that how you are governing them isn't fair, it's not just, and it should be done a different way. They may challenge you, they may disagree with your dictatorial strictures, and they may pose an existential threat to the tyranny they are under. And so, removal of free speech, most terrifyingly of all, isn't just a removal of what we are allowed to say, it's a control over our minds. The thing that we're supposed to have the most control over. We can't control our environment. We can't. We're supposed to be able to get something of a little bit of a control over this, but when you cannot say what you think or believe, this goes with it. This is shackled up with it, and you give that over to the state. The theory of linguistic relativity posits that language influences thought, not the other way around. So what you output can and will influence your input. So in really real, stark, tangible terms, if you want to improve your mental health, for example, you can clean up your speech. If you want to be more positive, you can monitor what you say and you can change what you say. You can stop saying negative things. If you challenge yourself to say no negative things for 30 days, which is really difficult, it's something I've tried to do. It could take you a year to get 30 days in a row. If you do that, you'll soon find that your inner life is more positive and happy too. In real terms, if somebody says prejudiced, bigoted or racist things, then they become prejudiced, racist and bigoted. They think those things too. So it's the world you create and it's the world you experience, and that's why Dostoevsky would warn us to be careful of what we say. We want the liberty to say what we believe, but be careful how you exercise that liberty. Of course, in a dictatorship, they're not going to let you exercise that liberty at all because they don't want you thinking. In 1984, we see the totalitarian state is replacing old speak, which is English as we know it, with new speak. And unlike other languages, this language was designed to make modes of thought not in line with the party ideology impossible. So they do this by eliminating undesirable words and also stripping from words all possible secondary meanings whatsoever. So that means poetry's gone. Great literature and scriptural wisdom literature is gone. You read Dante's Divina Commedia on 4 or 5 different levels simultaneously. Such works of staggering human beauty and thought could not be possible under this regime, nor could Shakespeare's soliloquies or sonnets. All ambiguities and shades of meaning have been purged out of the words, we're told in the appendix. And this means that all shades and nuances when it comes to different crime is abolished. So ultimately there's only thought crime. Everything comes under that. And that encompasses basically anything the party does not desire, and all acts are equally punishable by death. So for example in Newspeak, the word free, we're told, remained, but only insofar as to mean this field is free from weeds, or this dog is free from lice. It could not be used in its old sense of politically or intellectually free, since political and intellectual freedom no longer existed even as concepts and were therefore of necessity nameless. The aim was to diminish the range of thought, and every year, whilst other languages would add words to their dictionary, Newspeak dictionaries would shrink under this linguistic culling. In Orwell's Dystopia, Winston Smith, we see, commits a crime punishable by death when, after dreaming of rebellion and allowing his hatred for the party to fester, we see he commits his first act of rebellion by keeping a secret diary and writing in it. Forget about living on boiled cabbage, forget about bathtub gin, forget about the dirty tenements. My personal hell would be if someone removed my books and removed my freedom to write and speak, to think aloud in writing and speaking. When you remove this freedom, you remove the freedom to connect to others. And there's a real irony in these dystopias emphasising collectivism, because we see that the individuals in Orwellian dystopias are isolated, alone, and live in fear of one another. They never know love or passion or romance. There's also an irony in the fact that the book that warned of the dangers of censorship would, in very real-world oppressive regimes, face banning and censorship. In George Orwell's 1984, language and ideology are inextricably intertwined. You've got the idea of doublethink, which is the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both as true. War is peace. Freedom is slavery, really? And this doublethink allows the regime to manipulate the truth. In the book, the labyrinthine world of doublethink is described like this: to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which cancelled out, noting them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again, and above all to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis that you had just performed. And this sounds very much like how Hannah Arendt would characterise Nazi Germany. Winston writes in his diary, "Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death." It's a very profound thing. Don't worry about what might happen to you if the regime catches you. Don't worry about the punishment, because you are already punished, you're already in hell, and you are already dead. It's already happened. Orwell meditates through Winston Smith as to what the value of his writing is. And he essentially comes to the conclusion that he's writing, even if he ends up vaporized, even if he ends up disappeared, he's writing to the future, or to the past, or essentially to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone. He's writing to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. And if we feel like that's our time today, then we must heed his warning. Though, of course, just as Orwell scorned Huxley's dystopia, Huxley would take issue with Orwell's vision. Upon publication of 1984, Huxley wrote Orwell a letter praising his work, but essentially saying that the future would resemble his dystopia in Brave New World. Whether in actual fact the policy of the boot on the face can go on indefinitely seems doubtful, he said. My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and of satisfying its lust for power, and these ways will resemble those which I described in Brave New World. But what do you think? Are we living in Orwell's dystopia or Huxley's? Are we living in a hybrid? And if you've read either of these books before, please tell me what you made of them And join us at the Hardcore Literature Book Club for a read-through of these two works back-to-back at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Navigate over to the post of this discussion for some recommended resources and your reading assignment for our next lecture. We're going to inhale both of these books in a frightening flash across 4 to 5 weeks. We're going to be splitting them both right down the middle and reading them back to back. As I said at the beginning, we're starting with Brave New World, and lectures, as always, at the book club come out each and every weekend. So this weekend coming, we're going to be talking about Aldous Huxley's Dystopia in much more depth. And we've got some cool stuff coming out soon in addition to this lecture series and in addition to the lectures slated for the rest of the year. As you may know, if you've seen the book club schedule, we're going to be reading all of Homer. We're going to be reading Homer's epics over the course of summer in a really expansive reading project that's going to be really fun. We've got a lot of cool reads on the horizon for later in the year. We're going to read Jane Austen, we're going to read Charles Dickens, we're going to read Daphne du Maurier and Alexander Dumas. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we've got some really cool videos coming out soon. I'm going to put out my ranking and grading of the complete works of Shakespeare. You may know that we very recently wrapped up our chronological read-through of the complete works of Shakespeare at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We now have a lecture for every single work the Bard ever produced in the back catalogue. You can join that project at any time, and many have told me that is the most rewarding reading project they've ever conducted. We've got a very special show coming out soon to celebrate hitting the 150k milestone here on the YouTube channel, and I'm going to be bringing out a vlog soon, something that I don't do that often, but I'm going to bring out a vlog because I've got some special announcements to make in regards to a few things that have been going on in my life, and I would love to fill you in and let you know what's been going on. Thank you again for watching today, and I wish you all the very best for your deep reading of Brave New World and 1984, or indeed any dystopian work you want to bring yourself to. Again, join the read-through at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Happy reading, and bye-bye for now.